Hello and welcome to Fact Check UK, an independent podcast that has no links to any Tom or Rob based organisation. And how are you, Rob?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, yes. Enjoying it being the run up to Christmas. All the festive foods are in the shops, and that was good. Basically, I'm mostly Leibkuchen at this point of the year.
That's a good way to be. We recently had a Leibkuchen. Is it? Oh, I'm going to pronounce this wrong. We had Lebuchenhearts. We called them Lebuchenhearts. I think it's the same thing, except they're like full of marmalade, and we play fluffy bunnies with them, except you have to put them in your mouth and say Lebuchenheart. For the record, my top is about 6, and you feel very sick afterwards. But yeah, it's good. Christmas is coming. We're having debates about... Let's start, this is a political podcast, so I can start off with like a political statement, maybe to you and to chat. When is it acceptable to start playing Christmas songs?
Ooh. So the rule I've always held to is the 1st of December.
Yep.
I think if you're not a shop. I mean, I think the shops are fair enough that they have to basically we all know as soon as October 31st goes, Christmas hits all the shops. And I feel like that's when the shops start playing them. But I think on a personal level, it's December 1st.
You see, this is why we get on so well. I have exactly the same answer in my head. I think if you vote for me as Prime Minister, I'll make sure that the shops have like a 2-week head start. So 2 weeks before December 1st, they're allowed to play them, but not before. And I'm going to make it mandatory that shops must have like a Christmas radio station rather than one CD that repeats 20 songs every hour. Because I know too many people who work in retail who've been driven slowly insane over the Christmas period because of those CDs.
I was going to say, I'm pretty certain on DAB at least there is a Christmas-only radio station that starts sometime in November.
Wow, okay.
I'll have to find out what it's called, but...
yeah, do I need to listen to that? I'm not sure. I'm curious now.
I think it's called Smooth Christmas. Yep, that's it. Smooth Radio offers you Smooth Christmas. There you go. Bonus link for everyone.
Thank you very much.
So you can listen to Christmas music, not all year round. I don't know what they do in the summer. Maybe they just turn it into something else. Yeah. Summer radio. Who knows? So moving on to the main story tonight. Manifestos came out for all of the major parties. So we're going to go through those and compare policies. I'm assuming you want to do this by topic, and we'll just touch on the main parties. And if there's a particular minor party that has a big point to raise, we might switch over to discuss them at each point, but instead of going like, this is all of Labour's policies, this is all of the Conservative policies, because that would be much harder. So we'll just kind of go through point by point, yes?
Yeah, that's the best way to do it, yeah.
The big ticket item is, of course, Brexit. And you can see that the Conservative manifesto is about 40 pages shorter than the Labour one. And I think that's because their Brexit thing is, as we've just described, summed up as, let's get Brexit done. So presumably that section's quite short.
To put some more, slightly more detail on there, they want Brexit done, and they want it done now. I think if elected as a majority parliament, they say that they would achieve Brexit by the end of January, and the withdrawal bill would be brought before Parliament before Christmas. So, you've heard it about a lot of things. It'll all be done and dusted by Christmas, this war, all of that jazz. Yeah. They think this Brexit debacle will all be done and done by Christmas. We'll have a vote on it. You'll know it'll pass. You can have your Christmas in peace. That's part of the Conservatives' pledge. They've, agreed not to extend the transition period beyond December 2020. 2020 next year, so it's not this December, it's next December. Yeah, they're saying that, look, we can get this passed, and then within a year we'll, have a very swift exit. Some people might see that as a threat of no deal as well, kind of a no deal by the back door. We may have agreed a deal, but if still other bits and bobs during the transition period haven't been ironed out in the year between the EU, that could be a way to no deal and Brexit by another means. That's the Conservatives' Brexit pledges in a nutshell. I think they're very simple, they're to the point, and they clearly see it as one of their big strengths in this election.
Very clear, as we've said. I think we're getting quite good at describing this, but what is Labour's official policy on this? I know we've described the basic summary, but there's a few more points to it than what we've been saying. And I hope they've got it down to something snappier than that on the street.
Yeah, so, I mean, we have been quite harsh in the past on Labour's Brexit stance, and I think it was because it was, at some points, unclear which direction they're going to go. It's been really nice at this election to have it written down and to have some clarity over that position, which, although isn't as snappy as let's get Brexit done, I think it is still clear once presented. So if you vote Labour, they're going to get what they would call a better deal, but they're going to get a new deal from the EU within 3 months. And then within 6 months, they will put that deal to the public in a second referendum. So do you take the deal we've negotiated, or would you like to stay in the EU? Which, in my eyes, I've talked about this a lot in the past when we talked about referendums and how bad the EU referendum was, because if you voted out, there was no sort of clear white paper, there was no clear policies about what would happen. This sounds like a good referendum to me. I know what I'm getting if I vote to stay in the EU, and I know what I'm getting if we go out. Like the deal points will all be there. So that's their main Brexit pledge in a nutshell. Which is, yeah, I mean, what do you think of that? Do you think that's a vote winner on the doorstep, or do you think it's, again, Labour trying to walk the Brexit tightrope without annoying too many Remainers and too many Leavers?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we know, the Conservatives have made their bed. As you know, they're like, they realised they were losing people to the Brexit party, so the Conservatives are going all out. We are the party of Leave. We're going to lose some of those moderate Conservatives as they become this kind of moderate in the case of Brexit, I mean. And I suppose in some case moderates for other reasons, but that's because those things seem to be aligned for those people. Whereas with Labour, they know that a lot of Labour voters voted to leave, so they've got to really walk this tightrope when they also, and we also, we suspect that Corbyn is not the biggest fan of the EU. So that's partly why he's had to kind of say, I'm not going to vote one way or the other. I think there were mentions of Harold Macmillan doing a similar thing, but he let his cabinet campaign on it. So it's I don't think it's necessarily that similar a situation, really. It's a bit tough to describe, and I think a lot of people hear referendum, and if you're someone who is an adamant leaver, well, you don't want another referendum. You voted to leave, and you believe that we should just leave. If you're a Remainer, you would be like, oh, that's a good, maybe that's a good option, but you'd rather that someone was saying, let's revoke it and go back to the drawing board at least before we, do stuff. And then I don't know how many people there are in the middle really on this issue. That's the thing. Brexit's quite a divisive thing. So I wonder how well it's going. I mean, it'd be really interesting to hear an interview with someone who's been out on the streets for Labour, but obviously it's the kind of thing you're probably not going to hear about until after the election's over and done with.
I think maybe the strength of that policy is that you may not if you're passionate on either side of the Brexit debate, it's unlikely to sway you. However, when it comes to the realities of tactical voting, and if you're a voter that doesn't like the Conservatives much, and Labour the only ones to beat them in their constituency, then you could go, well, if I vote for Labour, I've got a chance of my Brexit outcome happening, and I really don't want Boris to get in, therefore I'll vote for them. Certainly, I don't think Brexit is one of the strengths of the Labour manifesto, and when we go into other points, I think that's where their manifesto really shines when we're looking at other policies they've got. But Brexit is the one question, is the one area where there's always been question marks and a little confusion about it, and I think this compromise gets them through this election, even if it's not the best policy on their books.
Yeah. And then we come to the Lib Dems, who are another party with a very clear position that they're campaigning for, which is revoke Article 50. But they've also now had to say what would happen in the event they don't win a majority, which, as we say, is very likely. So they've said in other circumstances they will fight for a people's vote with the option of staying in the EU and would campaign to remain. So that's opening up the door, surely, for them to work alongside Labour in the event that they could essentially be the kingmakers at the end of the general election.
Yeah, totally. The Lib Dems, like you say, have accepted they're not going to win this election. And if you're looking at this election, honestly, looking at the polls, I think that the possible outcomes are either a Conservative majority win or a minority government. I don't think Labour are in a realistic position yet to get a majority of seats. So that will force Labour to work with another party, and most likely that will be the SNP and the Lib Dems. So for the Lib Dems to make the point of what they do if, shock horror, the Lib Dems fail to get a majority, helps them a lot and may once again help people who are umming and ahhing in constituencies where they don't know which way to tactically vote. If there's a choice between a Conservative MP and a Lib Dem, and you're really for staying in Europe, I don't know why you wouldn't vote Lib Dem. If remaining in the EU was one of your top options, Lib Dems seem like a fairly clear choice. And, this Brexit policy, it's been consistent ever since the referendum result came in. Lib Dems were campaigning to remain before. They campaigned in 2017 on a very anti-Brexit platform. So it's no surprise that they're doing exactly the same in 2019. I think now where you've had... I think this election is more of a Brexit election than it was in 2017. That's where the Lib Dems are hoping to gain more traction. And this is probably one of the biggest vote-winning areas for the Lib Dems, their Brexit policy.
Yeah, I think there are definitely people who want to just vote Article 50 and remain. There are people who are pragmatic and think, feel getting the Lib Dems in gives a higher chance of there then being a referendum to remain. So it can definitely be a vote winner, especially if it's Lib Dems versus Conservatives in a constituency. It will be interesting to see what happens in Lib Dem Labour constituencies, but I think those are more they're fewer and far between, I believe, than the Conservative Lib Dem ones. Before we move on to the NHS, which is the next big ticket item, do we want to just briefly mention the Greens' view on this?
Yeah, I think we can do the Greens and the Brexit Party in one big bash. So, yeah, the Greens, they're going to campaign to remain in the EU, and if we remain, then probably through the European Parliament, we'll try and support directives that will help tackle climate change, which is, yeah, a very green policy, very consistent with what they've campaigned throughout, since 2017. And as we all know, it's even more unlikely that the Greens will get a majority in Parliament. They would be very lucky to increase the number of MPs from 1 to 2 this election, I feel. So their actual material influence on Brexit is marginal, but they still might help pick up some votes, and also be in a vote winner in Caroline Lucas's constituency that she's campaigning to remain. The Brexit Party, on the other hand, they basically say that Boris Johnson's deal isn't Brexit. As we all know, they want a clean break, or, as I would put it, a no-deal Brexit. They think that's the way to leave. However, since their pact with Johnson last time, and the fact they're not standing in any Conservative constituencies, which makes it even more unlikely that they're even going to gain a single seat, it's hard to take the Brexit Party seriously with this manifesto, and it'll come as a shock to no one that, they're for Brexit, but they just want a bit of a harder Brexit than Boris put in. It's probably the only policy that's worth looking at for the Brexit Party as well. I mean, it's in the name.
So, moving on to the NHS. So this is, the NHS, it should be a thing Labour wins on. Do you want to flip it round at this point and then touch on Labour's policy first, then go to the Conservatives?
Yeah, sure, let's do that.
Yeah, so as I say, Labour caused the NHS to exist in the first place. So what's their policy for the NHS? What are they offering?
So they, like a lot of the parties, are promising a lot of big spending. They've said they'll have 26 billion additional funds for the NHS by 2023 to 2024. There'll also be 10.8 billion for free personal social care for the over 65s. Social care in particular became a very big issue last election. That was an issue that Theresa May was trying to solve, and then got it very wrong with reports that, elderly people may be forced to sell their homes in order to pay for the social care schemes, which did put quite a dent in the Conservatives' already stuttering campaign back then. Social care is seen as one of the big crises in the UK with an aging population, how you deal with that. So there is a big need for there to be an injection of cash into that area of the health service, and because it's not directly tied to the NHS, it could be forgotten about, because it's more of an ongoing care. It's not sort of, if you go to hospital, you get yourself sorted and you move out. Social care is far more long term and usually tackled privately. So having those injections, publicly and so much cash can have a big impact, and I think will be a big vote winner. 3 more points. You'll have a battle of GPs, and we will talk about this when we talk about the Conservatives. But Labour have pledged to train a new generation of MPs. They've pledged to train
of GPs.
Thank you. Pledged to train a new generation of GPs, provide 27 million more GP appointments, and increasing training places from 35,000 to 5,000. They've also said that they will have free prescriptions, dental checkups, and hospital car parking. Hospital car parking is a good one to pick up on. It's one of the big bugbears I find as somebody who works for a hospital and knows what it's like to park outside the hospital, and then how much you got to pay for it when you've got friends and relatives staying. It's one of those irritations that I know that people suddenly think, oh goodness, I'm coming here and this is the last thing I need to pay £10 a day for parking or whatever. So I think that'll be a good vote winner. And finally, to end private provision within the NHS and to stop the sale of the NHS to any state-run pharmaceutical companies. Labour have been big on the point that any Brexit deal may lead us closer to the US, which may lead us in turn to having to sell off our NHS to the Americans. Trump was famously quoted as saying that everything's on the table and the NHS might be part of a deal in those things. So they've been quick to put that point across. The Conservatives have been even quicker to try and rebuke that. And there's been, lots of Conservatives saying the NHS is not for sale, the NHS is not for sale. So expect to see that in the Conservative manifesto, but it's still a point that's gaining some traction for Labour when it comes to talking about the NHS and care.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's the thing a lot of people are reasonably worried about. We've seen privatisation of the NHS, parts of the NHS being sold off, like, within the UK. And in fairness, like, some of that was under New Labour as well. It's not all the Conservatives, but it seems to have accelerated under the Conservative government. So, it's not a thing. Like, the NHS is a really great institution, and we can't just slowly sell off bits of it piecemeal. That starts to defeat the purpose of it. And then there's the concern it could get to a point where it would then collapse, and then we'd be stuck with a system like they have in America, which I definitely don't want. I've spoken to a lot of Americans about the sheer cost of getting things done, and it's just not okay. I definitely believe healthcare should be free at the point of point of care. So yeah, I can understand why they're big on that, because I think a lot of people feel very strongly about that. So next up is the Conservatives on NHS, and they seem to have they're trying their best to kind of turn around this idea of austerity that they've been pushing for the last 10 years, aren't they? So what are they offering to the NHS?
Yeah, so again, we've got the battle of the figures here when it comes to the NHS. So whereas Labour said that they would have 26 billion, the Conservatives said they will have 20.5 billion additional funding to the NHS, and they've said they'd have additional money to cover rising pension costs, which, again, hey, talk about pensions. We're talking to our key demographic of voters. Hopefully that will get us on board. Build 40 new hospitals over the next 10 years and give 20 hospitals an extra 1.8 billion cash injection. So that's more investment in infrastructure than maybe Labour, and saying that, where their priorities lie. 5 billion for social care. Again, that's less than the 10.8 billion of free personal social care that Labour pledged. Also, they've got talk about ending hospital car parking charges for England. I know that's, on the front page of the Telegraph. I saw that as one of the big manifesto points being put across. So it's clear that the Conservatives think that that's a vote winner as well. And finally, there's the GPs, where they say they'll have 6,000 more GPs and 50,000 more nurses. Now, this figure in particular has caused some debate and some controversy. The number that they've said that there's 50,000 new, it may actually be the fact that they'll maintain 50,000 nurses, or they'll rehire 50,000 nurses, which doesn't mean that you're getting 5,000 extra, in my view. It just looks like you're keeping the number the same. Jess Phillips, who is a Labour MP, tweeted tonight, I saw that she says, I have 2 sons. If I decide to keep my 2 sons, do I have 2 extra sons? Or, that's breaking it down like that makes it seem so obvious. So, yeah, this is, when it comes to the NHS, I think it's clear that both main political parties all think there should be extra funding. I know I said we weren't going to touch on the smaller parties for everything, but let's have a look at, if you look at the Brexit Party and the UKIP manifesto on the NHS, which are the furthest to the right, and you'd expect maybe one of them might talk about privatising the NHS in some way, shape or form, or having, less money put in. Even the Brexit Party say keep the NHS publicly owned with no private provision, and UKIP say that they would add an extra 2 billion in social care funding a year. So you can see how there seems to be a consensus among all political parties that more money needs to be put into the NHS. The big question is how much. And on that point, I think it's clear that Labour win the battle of how much money can you spend on the NHS.
Yeah. And then we have the Lib Dems, who are offering, again, to spend more money per year on the NHS. But I think possibly the interesting thing is they've included in that policy how they're going to do it. So we're going to get onto taxation in general in a minute. But the Labour is, we're spending this without an immediate, here's how. They then go on to taxation. Whereas in the Lib Dems, it's very clear they're putting 1p on income tax to go to the NHS, which, seems like a reasonable way of doing it. Everyone gets taxed across the board. And it's not like, well, we'll get to taxation in a minute, but you'll see why that's a relevant point.
Yeah, I have a tiny gripe about this policy, and it's kind of a personal. It's a personal one. It's that the Lib Dems roll out this amazing idea that if we just had 1p more tax, it could fund something amazing. And I think they rolled it out in 2017 and they rolled it out in 2015. And of course, they've never been able to implement it. And I just kind of want to see the Lib Dems maybe do a different policy from year to year. Just for me, it sounds great. And I'm not bashing 26 billion extra by the year 2023. And the 1p rise in income tax always feels good because you're like, hey, what would it matter to me if I lost a penny? If everybody lost a penny and they could all chip in, that sounds amazing. But also at the same time, I'm like, you've used that one before. Change the record, Lib Dems. But maybe that's just me.
It's a penny on every pound, though, right? That would be.
Yes, but it's represented here as a 1p rise in income tax, which sounds like to the layperson, it sounds like you're maybe just losing a penny.
Yes, no, I can understand that. So, that's what I want to be clear on. It is a 1% increase in income tax across the board to fund the NHS, which sounds like it could definitely generate enough money, but it would obviously be taxing everyone who is experiencing income tax. So, you can work out what percentage of your, you can work out what 1% of your income over 12,500 is, and then you could work out how much that would cost you a year.
Yeah, definitely. It's just my personal gripe at a reused Lib Dem policy.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I just wanted to be clear that it's 1%, not 1 penny each, because that's not much money. So now we move on to taxation. So we'll start off with the Conservatives again. And this is the bit where it always seems to me like the Conservatives are promising. So people will rightly complain about Labour saying, "Oh, well, we can do this, this, and this." Spend where and then people say, "Well, where's that money coming from?" And then their answer is normally we're going to raise taxes. But the Conservatives are offering all of these new things, although, as we say, some things like 6,000 new nurses is not really new, but then they're not really planning on increasing any tax. So where are they getting this money from?
Yeah, good question. Why haven't they been asked that before? I mean, the Conservatives' response has always been ideologically that a high tax suppresses business and actually works against you in the long term. So what you've got to do is cut tax, and it allows businesses to grow more. So, 5% of a billion is more than 5% of half a billion or whatever. That's a, very basic, of 10% of, or 7.5%. You can tell that I was rubbish at maths, can't you? But you know what I'm getting at? That, if you just set a percentage on something and business booms, then overall you'll gain more money because you've let businesses grow rather than taxing them, which shrinks them. And amongst their more specific manifesto pledges, they're saying that corporation tax will be cut from 19% to 17% to help save $6 billion. They think that's going to get that much money in there. There's also been some talks in some quarters of a Brexit boon. There's not many actual figures to back up the idea that us leaving will lead to an increase in business. However, Boris's part of his speech yesterday was when he was talking about let's getting Brexit done. He said the reason that the economy is stuttering at the moment is because nobody's willing to invest, because there's uncertainty about the future and what will happen if we're going to leave or not. If we decide to leave, he says there will just be a big release of funds into the economy, which will help boost it up almost instantly. Once again, I'm pretty skeptical of that because some people contend that the only reason the UK economy hasn't slipped into recession is because people have been investing more to stockpile goods in the event of a no-deal Brexit, and they did it twice. So we've had two of those big injections of cash into the economy, and we might not get one if we were to leave orderly or disorderly. Particularly disorderly would have a bigger impact on the economy. So, and finally, it's worth noting that the Conservatives, with their increase in spending to help, go against the austerity policies of Cameron before them, would again increase national debt. It would run up more national debt. There's no way that they can, pledge all this spending and cut taxes and not increase debt at a level. So they are going to do that, but somehow the Conservatives have managed to get away with a lot of questioning on those issues, I feel, because as we move on to Labour, Labour try and fund their policies, but there's also a bigger worry, or I think a bigger worry on the street that people say, Corbyn's going to bankrupt the country, which I feel is an unfair assessment of where Labour stand on the economy.
We touched on this a bit last time. It's weird that there's this, as I said, there's this like idiom that, if you come in and there's like an IOU note from Labour to the next government, but it's not as clear cut as that. There have obviously been Labour governments during bad times, 60s and 70s, who, as I say, not necessarily down to that Labour government's policies, but you could also say they're a factor. But then obviously you have New Labour who were there during a boom period. And it's funny that people say, New Labour spent all the money. And you're like, well, no, like the recession happened outside of that. And then we ended up with a Conservative government afterwards anyway, because of course we were going to. The New Labour had been in power for so long that it was bound to switch eventually. So yeah, it's interesting in that way. I think one point I just want to talk about is a corporation tax, because it's mentioned in all of these, and we're going to get to the other two in a second. But this idea that we reduce corporation tax, and if we reduce corporation tax, then the companies can grow and we'll get more money because we're still getting a percentage of that more money. Now, firstly, that assumes after Brexit, we're going to have all our companies growing, which may or may not be the case. So, there's a lot of economic arguments that we're going to have a downturn because of Brexit. So that's probably not going to work, I would assume. But the other thing is we have a rate of 19% corporation tax at the moment, which is a lot lower than it has been in the past in the UK. I just thought it'd be worth comparing that because people don't. There's this idea that if you raise corporation tax too much, it will force companies to leave the UK and go somewhere else. So it's probably good to see what's around us in range and like what other countries have. So there are 4 countries on Wikipedia at this link who have 19% corporation tax. So that's us, Slovenia, Poland, and the Czech Republic. Then with countries that have more than us is quite a lot. So it's Afghanistan, Brunei, Cambodia, Finland, Iceland, Russia, Thailand, Portugal, the US, Sweden, like Denmark. There's a lot of countries above us, like by a few percent. And if we go all the way up,
the US being higher is really surprising. Actually,
yeah,
I would have thought they would have been lower.
It's 21% plus up to 12% local state tax. So it could be as high as 33% in the US. Obviously that depends. Norway's 23%, South Korea 24%, China 25%. Same as Zimbabwe, interestingly enough. Italy 27.9%, of which 24% is government and 3.9% is municipal. Luxembourg 29.2%. And I know people often talk about Luxembourg in the same way they do as Switzerland, and they're quite different in that. Mexico has 30%. France has 31% on profits over $500,000 and 28% below that. And the highest is American Samoa at 44%, but they have a scale of rates. And Canada has 38% as its highest rate. So, yeah, there's a lot of range in these rates. Corporation tax of significantly more than that might be problematic, but there's a big range to go into without suddenly being, there's this idea that if the corporation tax gets too high, everyone will flee. And it's like, well, actually, we're quite similar to a lot of countries around us, and there are a lot of countries near us, like France, who have a higher rate. So it's not as clear cut as people often spin it.
Yeah, precisely. And when we move on to like what Labour are saying and how Labour say they will fund their policies, a lot of Labour say that they will do so by an increase in taxation. And people present this as quite like a radical idea and that our economy could never support it. But I've seen graphs where you've compared it to the rest of Europe, and the taxation level would still be lower than that of both France and Germany under a Labour government in the UK. And as far as I know, they're, like Germany and France have, are competing with us for like the biggest economies in Europe and have been powerhouses of Europe for many, many years. So it's maybe not as scary as the Conservatives would put forward, but it certainly would be a big change. But on the grand scale of things, when you look at it on a global scale, it actually puts us more in line with some of the bigger economies.
Yes. So while we're still on taxation, we still have to cover Labour and the Lib Dems. So Labour, what's their big plan for tax?
Yes, so their big plan for tax is that they will, the top 5% of earners will pay more income tax, including a new 50% rate on anybody who earns an income over £125,000. They'll also increase corporation tax to 26%. I'm not quite sure where that puts them on your world scale. That would be the same as...
that would be the same as 26% would put you at Algeria and Bhutan and the Falkland Islands.
Oh, nice.
And above India and Austria, and above China. So, that does start to put us in the very much in the top, but it's still below Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany, Japan. Yeah. So it's still big, it's not like you can't, there's not an obvious rule there between like GDP of nations. It's just however countries have set themselves up, really.
Yeah. And as an aside, did you see the £80,000 question time man?
I did. This is one thing I've seen the full clip of. I'm not sure. We'll post this clip in the show notes for people. And yeah, maybe go watch it now and make up your own mind before you hear my opinion. But this guy, and so he earns over £80,000. and he started criticising the Labour thing because he's saying, oh, you're going to tax me because I earn over £80,000. I'm not in the top 5% of earners. Now, he is objectively wrong. If you earn over £80,000 in the UK, you are in the top 5% of earners. And he starts going on about billionaires and stuff like this. And I don't know if he fundamentally misunderstands percentages of population. So yes, 80,000 pounds is not comparable to a billionaire. But that doesn't mean you're not in the top 5% when in a country where I think the median income is about 26 grand. Is that right? It's definitely under 30. So, if you're earning nearly 4 times the average person, then it's not surprising you're in the top 5%. And obviously the top 1% of earners will be billionaires. I think it's billionaires, millionaires. But again, it's not actually that high. It's maybe 130,000. There were some numbers that I've seen, but don't quote me on the 1% figure. But I think, the figure for 5% was about 78 or something. So someone earning £80,000 a year is in that 5% tax bracket. Personally, I believe I should be taxed more, and I'm definitely not on that kind of money. So, I think that man, massively misunderstood what's actually happening, other than the fact that he's going to be taxed under this proposal, which is true. I also wonder if he misunderstands how tax works as well, because there's a very good diagram I've seen going around on Facebook. So our tax is in brackets in the UK, and I was surprised to learn this is not the case in the US. So there are some people in the UK who still think it works in the way it does in the US, where you get and again, I'm not au fait necessarily with the US system, but as I understand it in the US, if you increase the percentage of tax on someone, that applies to either all their earnings or the majority of all their earnings over a certain amount. Whereas in the UK, you have a tax-free allowance, and then above that, you're on 20%, 25%. I think it's 25% initially, and then it's 35%. It's 40% if you go over 50 grand. And then, as we're saying, there's this extra 50% one they're proposing over 100 grand. That doesn't mean that a person on £49,000, 999. So sorry, a person on £49,999 a year, if they go to £50,000, well, if they go to 50,001 because they have to go over the threshold, that person would only be taxed more on that £1 over 50,000. They don't suddenly get taxed an extra 10%, an extra 5% on all of their earnings because of the way it's done proportionally. So there are some people who I think fundamentally misunderstand that. So you always get 12.5 grand in the UK at the moment for free, no tax. And then the next chunk is taxed 25%, and then 35, then 40, and then this proposal would add in 50%. So that means people who are already earning over that threshold would end up with less take-home pay. But also, if you're earning over 100 grand, you don't really need all that extra money, is the point being made.
I think people have done the sums on this chap. If he earns over 80,000, and assuming that he's earning I think 80,000 is just at the limit of the 5%. So it's quite low down. They said it worked out he'd be spending around about 30 quid extra a year. So if you're earning 80 grand, you can probably spare the 30 quid to pay for schools and hospitals and stuff. So that clip has been, it's one I've been coming back to and watching again and just thinking, really? He's still saying it? I know it's a recording, but every time he says it, I'm still shocked that somebody would let those words come out of their mouth.
I think that it's the bit where he digs in, and then you see the Labour guy actually kind of goes, no, we're not going to and he's like, what are you actually on? And the guy's like 80 grand. And he's like, oh, well, yes, no, we would. That's the whole point. And it's kind of like, I think you've fundamentally misunderstood something here. And it's just hard to watch because, I mean, I'd like to think that person has now gone home, been a little less hot-headed, had someone explain to him and gone, oh, sorry, I'm an idiot. But, you don't see that on the clip. You just see the actual altercation. As I said, the Lib Dems, we don't think they're going to get in as the majority party. So it's not that important, really. I don't think it's not the big thing they're going to go to a potential coalition partner or voting pact partner and say, this is their most important thing. They're going to care about Brexit most. So maybe we should skip on in the interests of time.
Agreed. Yeah.
Okay. So next up we have the economy. And again, Labour, big policies that cost money.
Yes. So 400 billion National Transformation Fund, including 250 billion for energy, transport and the environment, 150 billion for schools, 250 billion in loans and a new national investment bank. Rail, mail, water and the energy grid taken back into public ownership, which is that's kind of the biggest deal reading this manifesto, I would say. So looking through it, rail back into public ownership is one where I think public opinion of private rail is very low. I don't use it often, but when I do, I'm always surprised at the prices I have to pay. And think I could just take a megabus instead. And the whole point of privatizing the railways initially, if you were to believe in like the free market and what it should do, is you should have lots of people, you should have lots of corporations competing over these lines, and that helps to bring the price down because, you know, they're trying to compete with each other. If they all, you know, they'll try and undercut each other and eventually you'll get affordable rail travel. That's not been the case for the last 10 years, I'd argue. Like, it's slowly, the fees have slowly crept up and up and up. So
I think as long as I've been buying my own rail tickets, the prices have gone up consistently and outside of line with inflation.
Yeah. So I think that, like, for those reasons alone, like, Labour on to a winner there to nationalise rail again. Mail, I think, is probably less controversial as well. Royal Mail already exists. To take that back, you know, is fair. Then, like, water and energy back into public ownership is something where it shouldn't be controversial, because you'd think that, you know, energy and water are basic necessities. It would seem very sensible to have a price cap on those, or fair prices for all. And I remember under Miliband in particular that, you know, there was a lot of talk about back in the 2015 election, there was a lot of talk about how do you limit how much energy companies are raising their, like, gas prices in particular, and the impact that has on, like, pensioners over the winter. You need to make sure that the advice shouldn't be shop around and get the best deal. You should have some controls on the energy firms and make sure that they provide affordable energy without people, you know, you could have people who can't afford to pay gas over winter and ultimately have severe health repercussions because of it. So that's why Labour's going for it. But there are, to my mind, like, an awful lot of independent energy and water companies. There's a lot of competition when it comes to those, particularly, you know, I know that when I buy a rail ticket, I don't often have the choice of which like branch I go with, which company I go with, because companies tend to buy up lines, don't they, and services. Like Southwest trains are run by...
Yeah, they'll have the rights to a franchise. For example, Virgin have had the West Coast Main Line, for example.
Yeah, but with energy, I can buy my energy from a variety of different suppliers. That's why they're more competitive. So I feel that'll be more of a challenge to the market. And also the other thing is, when you think about the history of the Labour Party, Tony Blair got elected in 1997 after removing Clause 4, which was a big thing that committed the party to promoting public ownership. And his removal of that took a lot of energy from within the party, and kind of it marked a massive step in that party as it was abandoning nationalisation. So to take the party back in this direction is a huge call by Jeremy Corbyn, but I would probably argue that the ground has never been more fertile for that sort of change in the way that we deal with our basic utilities. Back in 1997, nationalisation was definitely a vote loser. In 2017 and 2019, I think it could be a big vote winner for a large proportion of the country.
I think it's interesting because it's one where I can see it very much splitting the vote along age lines, because when you talk to people who were around with nationalised services, there is a general impression that nationalised services were bad. or at least this is the impression I've got from talking to people quite a bit older than myself.
Have you been watching The Crown, the new series of The Crown?
I've not been watching The Crown, no.
If you watch The Crown, that's not a bad point, because they do the 3-day work week, which was influenced by lots of national services being unable to have enough production to power the country through 5 weeks. So because the energy companies couldn't provide enough power, it was reduced to a 3-day work week. So I think people who lived through that's
exactly.
their memory
of. It's that kind of thing. It's people. I think near the end, National Rail, when it was literally a national thing as opposed to just the kind of overarching control thing, had a different name, didn't it? British Rail. When it was British Rail, sorry, as opposed to National Rail, I believe there were, people will be like, oh, there were delays, etc. But like, that's not necessarily because it was controlled nationally, and it's not like we don't have delays now, I think would be my argument. But I think, I do think there's probably a split where older voters would be like, no, that wasn't so good. We lived through that. Whereas younger, more idealistic voters are like, that's the thing we should strive towards, and they've never experienced what it was like with it. So I could see it splitting kind of quite down the middle of the country, depending on your age bracket. Moving on from that, what are the Conservatives doing for the economy? Or planning to do, sorry.
So the Conservatives have got this new 3.6 towns fund for 100 towns to improve their local economy. That's one of the big pledges that Jacob Rees-Mogg has been talking about, and I think to me it clearly speaks to the Conservative voter in a rural constituency. I know I go on about that a lot, but if you're a Conservative voter living out in the countryside, they often have the impression that a lot of funds are put into cities rather than into rural areas, and why don't they ever get a share of the money? These 100 towns picked are they're in more Conservative voting areas. I know that might sound cynical, that they're looking to look after their own, but those constituencies would consider themselves neglected for some time. And that kind of investment, although much smaller than Labour's, could prove a good vote winner for the Conservatives, particularly where where they're trying to hold seats this election. They've also pledged £5 billion to support getting broadband to the hardest to reach areas in 20% of the country. Speaking of broadband, that's one of the things we didn't mention out of Labour's manifesto pledges. One of the big ones was they say they would provide free broadband for all, classing it as an amenity, the same as water, energy, broadband. They now say is such a big part of our lives. It would be hard to imagine anybody who can live without the internet in this day and age. So,
or again, I suppose maybe more accurately that not that you could not live without it, but because obviously some people do, but more that it is putting people back if they do not have access to it. So it should be a public good, because if you have people who don't have access to the internet, then they'll find it harder to get jobs, etc., etc. They'll find it harder to skill themselves up. So if they're in poorer communities, then their chance of improving their life is going to be hindered by not having access to the internet.
Yeah, precisely. I think this is quite clearly a pro-Labour statement that I've seen on like Facebook and places, but they said if you have to apply for job seekers allowance, or you have to do, you have to register for some things, you can only do that online. And if you're one of the poorest people in the country and you can't afford any broadband and you can't afford to get online, that isn't that locking you out of a system? And the world is, the way the modern era is building towards, more and more stuff is being put online, more government forms are being put online. You need to be online to access a lot of those services, I feel. So, yeah, the broadband battleground is another one that's been making the front pages of a lot of papers. And again, I think that's in favour of Labour. Labour saying it'll be free, while Conservatives promising more investment. I think it's obvious that Labour have the more appealing policy there. But then the Conservatives will rebut that with, but how are you going to pay for it, Labour? That's kind of the Conservatives' response to everything that Labour's doing. Labour is clearly investing more. The Conservatives just feel that, the country won't be able to afford it. And the Conservatives think that their plan is more reasonable. the Conservative. I'm going to sum up the whole Conservative manifesto here from what I've seen so far, particularly on the economy and how much they're investing. The Conservative one is quite a safe manifesto, and there's nothing radical about that. I know we shouldn't be surprised by that. They are Conservatives, after all. They shouldn't be looking to reinvent the wheel. But Labour is by far the most radical that we've had in terms of spending for a while. You look back at previous elections and how they were run, you couldn't really tell a lot of different... the spending proposals were an extra billion here or an extra percent here or there, but they were kind of the same. I think, particularly when you look at the economy part of the manifestos, it's a sign of how far the two parties have moved apart ideologically wise.
Moving to the left and to the right,
yes,
respectively. Yeah.
Precise, yeah.
So in that case, we'll move on to the next, the other big thing that everyone's talking about, and that is climate / the environment. And this is really interesting to see, because while not all of them agree on exactly timings and percentages, this, I think, is the first time that every single party, major party, has had a green, like a properly green stance that seems like they're actually trying to enact something. And I feel like that might be the death knell for the Greens, really, because they've been trying to get this on the agenda for so long, and now everyone else is talking about it. And I suppose in some way that's them winning, but I don't know if they'll ever get above their one MP now.
Yeah, and I feel it's become such a big issue that the main parties can't ignore it anymore. You may argue that back in 2010, when David Cameron took over and started riding his bike to Parliament and changed the Conservative logo from a torch to a green tree, there's been a feeling, like particularly amongst Conservatives, that the environment matters in a little way, and all the other parties have been fighting over how much you do that, but it's come to the fore like a lot. I think particularly like the Greta Thunberg effect has been really big within 2019, and will push that to the front of many people's minds, or will be. I've structured the points that we're talking about in kind of like the level of importance people give to them. I think this will be a Brexit election, but it's also going to be an election on the NHS, taxation, and the environment. They are the big issues that I think are dominating the conversation at the moment. And just a quick look over all the manifestos. Everybody's promising more climate action, apart from, look at UKIP. Look at UKIP just going, sod the environment. It's really weird to see that.
It is very weird, but I don't think UKIP are going to do particularly well in this election.
They're not, but they're going to scrap the Climate Change Act, rejuvenate the UK's coal industry, and, screw wind turbines and solar panels. But sorry, it's just really weird to see that, like, one party going, screw the environment. But anyway, looking at these manifestos from the Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrats, they are all varying shades of green. I think you're right saying that the Green Party is going to struggle. They clearly have the greenest manifesto, a most radical one where it comes to the environment. So the Greens are suggesting all their investment will be 100 billion a year to tackle climate change and make Britain carbon neutral by 2030. Big investment in wind energy and to phase out petrol and diesel car sales by 2030. Like, big long-term plans, but a lot of them are cherry-picked for other parties, but they've adjusted the timescale somewhat. So the Conservatives promise net zero emissions by 2050. So Labour says aim for net zero emissions by 2030s, and to have 90% of electricity and 50% of heat from renewable or low-carbon sources by 2030. So everybody's going for the same thing, but just on a varying scale. I think the other interesting point that Labour's pointed out here when it comes to the environment is 5.6 billion for flood defences, prioritising areas in the northwest of England, Yorkshire, and the East Midlands. Unsurprisingly, the areas that were hit most recently by the floods. right at the start of this general election campaign, and something that the Conservatives have been criticised for throughout their 9 years in power. I feel like every time we've had a flooding disaster, there has been some criticism of the amount of money that was put into flood defences, particularly as we were in a time of austerity. A lot of people saying, how do you invest in your flood defences and balance the economy in that way? And I think Michael Gove was DEFRA at the time, and he came under a lot of fire for that. So there's no surprise to me that Labour have made a point of putting flood defences in their manifesto as a direct comparison to the Conservative efforts over the last 9 years.
Yeah, it's interesting just seeing like the slight twists on this thing, as you say. So Labour net zero by 2030s, Lib Dems by 2045, Conservatives by 2050. And then they're all promising to plant more trees. Although I think it was, I think Lib Dems are offering more trees than Conservatives. And then obviously the Green Party said something like 200 million trees or something that's almost impossible to achieve unless you are, I mean, like if you had a Green majority government, it would happen. But otherwise, no. Leading to a very good joke on the Now Show about Leaves on the Line, which I'm only bringing up because I'm going to insert a clip here so you can see that we were advertised on the Now Show this week.
Now, they have commentary on parliamentary coverage now on big nights.
Well, the opposition are furious. They think it's unparliamentary language, and they could be right.
Yeah. So, yeah, climate. Everyone is suddenly pro-climate, and that's not particularly surprising, I suppose. Not pro-climate, but pro-sorting out the climate crisis, at least, or being seen to be.
Yes, I think being seen to be is the most accurate way of putting it. There's always been a tension at the heart of green politics. How do you go? How far can you be green without sort of like demolishing some of the presets of society? You know, we could all go back living in I'm taking it to the extreme. If you wanted to be very green, you could ban all cars, couldn't you? But that would have massive effects on, you know, our transport and infrastructure and how that would work. So every party is trying to look at, you know, finding a realistic path and a realistic time frame to it. The other thing about green policies that always strikes me is they're always aiming for a target in the future, and that target almost always goes beyond the tenure of, you know, the parliament. There's no 5-year targets. They're all 10 or 20 years. So, you know, they are hard manifesto policies to keep the promise for, or be shown, or to be disproved that you haven't kept that promise. So the Conservatives can aim for net. They can aim to be it by 2050, but if it's not neutral by that time, and Labour had a couple of stints in power, you know, all had 15 years being in power since then the Conservatives could just say, oh, we couldn't keep our manifesto policies because Labour were in charge, and, you know, they were burning all the coal. So yeah, it's really tough to enforce, but really important at this election that the reason that every party apart from UKIP are being pro-environment shows that it's one of the rare issues that everyone seems united on, and in agreement with that something needs to be done. It's just the scale on which it needs to be done is the main disagreement there.
So we spent quite a lot of time on the different manifesto kind of main points. Obviously Brexit, big talking point. But yeah, NHS, the economy, Brexit also involved, and environment there. Would you be able to give us like a summary of each manifesto? Like, how do you think the manifestos are doing? If you see what I mean, maybe a better way of looking at it.
Okay, yeah. So I'll start. The Lib Dems seems like a copy paste of 2017. Put Brexit in bold.
Okay. Yep.
Okay. Brexit has more weight at this election. That's the only way they're going to increase their vote share. So, and as you've said, as we've alluded, the reason why we've skipped past the Lib Dems and a lot of this is, they're not really going to get into power anyway. So it's kind of a protest vote, and it's sort of a, you know, you can rail against the machine that, you know, the two main parties aren't going to definitely stop Brexit. So Labour, your Stop Brexit party. So that's the Lib Dems in a short while. The Conservatives is just safe. And then again, they've put Brexit in bold, but let's get it done this time. I think one of the big failings for Theresa May's campaign in 2017 was that getting Brexit done was sort of seen as a given. So the election wasn't fought on Brexit. It was therefore fought on things that the Conservatives weren't very strong on. So things like social care, for example, which they messed up big time on. Those proved to be real weaknesses and stopped them from being able to get a majority government. This one plays it safe, isn't really too radical. I've heard Boris Johnson call it One Nation, which I think is a bit of a stretch when you look at the One Nation, like the actual One Nation Conservatives that are leaving the party and not standing this time round, as the party seems to move further to the right. The one crucial thing that the Conservatives have done is they're trying to shake off this austerity tag. If the Conservatives still had David Cameron in charge, it would be impossible for them to win this election, I feel, because they would be forever tied to the actions of 2010. But because Boris Johnson's in charge, a new leader, it's all about Brexit. Oh, and by the way, we're going to spend some more money. They can shake it off a little bit. So Conservatives are underwhelming, but still likely to gain some traction amongst their core voters. And then finally, Labour's manifesto. This is one of the ones where, I've mentioned it before. I think it's one of the more radical manifestos. It's full Corbyn. If you wanted to say that, we said in 2017 that Corbyn had some of the shackles thrown off, as everybody said, right, well, we don't know, you're low in the polls. We don't know how this is going to go, but let's just go for one of the most left-wing manifestos ever and see how it does. Because it went so well, I think they've been fine to hand this one over to Corbyn's team, that wing of the party, and say, right, do what you really want to do, and let's see how the public takes it. So that's the one that, this is a Corbyn manifesto. It's the most change the country would see in a long while. I think if you get a Labour government, you're going to see a massive change. You're going to go, it's going to be the biggest change you've had in this country since we've had Thatcherism in there. Blairism was Thatcherism 2.0 to an extent, where you had a strong economy but also put more funds back into public services. Corbynism is way more national spending and bring it onto a level that is gonna change the country a lot if he gets in. So the most impressive, I think, is Labour. If that means it's the most successful is an entirely different story. I think the one word of warning I would just wrap this whole segment up with is that in 2017, the Conservatives had, I think it's unarguable to say that Theresa May was a bad campaigner during the 2017 election.
Yeah, I think that's a fair representation of it, yeah.
Yeah, and had a fairly bad manifesto with policies that actively drew some Conservative supporters away, and she still won 40% of the vote, there or thereabouts. Meanwhile, Labour were able to raise their vote to 40% because of their manifesto, and I think, despite their leader now, you have a situation in 2019 where the Conservatives have not got a leader who is as bad as at campaigning as Theresa May. Boris Johnson, although he's not setting the world on fire, doesn't seem to be, having the same nightmare that Theresa May did. Their manifesto has none of the big gotchas that the 2017 one did, so that might be enough to push them over the line. Labour will have to hope that this manifesto gets the surge of young voters, that all those people who are registering to vote really will vote for them. And even then, I think the best they can hope for is stopping a Conservative majority government and possibly trying to enact some of those policies as part of a minority administration.
Yeah, I think with your view of the manifestos, we should lead into our quick polls update. And so firstly, just a note to our listeners, the links we always used to put in for this have now changed because Britain Elects is now officially part of newstatesman.com. I don't know if that was just always behind the scenes. I don't know if there's been a significant why there's been this change, but it's now BritainElects.newstatesman.com. You have to give them an email address to get through. Apologies about that. We will still be putting screenshots in the show notes, so if you don't want to give them your email, you can see the results there. And oh my, how things have changed since 2 weeks ago, there's a very handy line they've put on here for when the MPs voted for the election. So you can see the results from there. And I think we were last here. Yeah, when we were last looking at this, the Conservatives were starting to tend a tiny bit downwards. Labour were coming up this little rise post the vote for an election. And Lib Dems and Brexit were starting to drop a bit, and the Greens were kind of sitting flat. And I think maybe I'll try and give my summary here, and then you can delve into it a bit more and maybe pick apart my opinions, because I feel you probably have a better view of this than I do, so I'll just give my view of it.
Sure.
So since then, the Conservatives plateaued for a short while and are now shot up by about 5%. So that is not what we predicted at all when we were talking about this a few weeks ago. Labour are still steadily rising, but not as much. So we have the Conservatives on 42.4% and Labour on 29.6%, which is quite a big gap to close. Lib Dems have consistently, well, they plateaued for a bit and then they've started to consistently lose percentage. They're down at 14.7%. And the Brexit Party has fallen off a cliff and is almost down as low as the Greens. So I think what we're seeing there is the effect of the thing we talked about last time, which was initially the Brexit Party was going to go in all seats, and then Nigel Farage realised, that's going to screw over the Conservatives. So kind of said, we're not really going to... So basically the Brexit Party fell out of the election. Whatever they're saying, whatever their manifesto is, that realistically, they're not going up against everything. There's no way they can win a majority. So, Brexit Party has just dropped out, and looks like the majority of those voters have gone over to the Conservatives. And you could probably, by eye, it looks like people who are leaving the Lib Dems are probably small about maybe going over to the Greens and the others going over to Labour. So there we are. It's quite a stark contrast in the polls. The only the only thing to take into account here when you're looking at that is that we know the Conservatives always do well in certain quite large areas that are, like rural areas that have a large number of voters spread over a wide area. And Labour tends to do better in the kind of cities where it's more concentrated, so they can get more seats for the number of votes. So that helps affect it a bit. And then if you have the Lib Dems potentially going into this kind of, we will have a referendum alliance with Labour, then they will, they might be fighting against the Conservatives more. So that may still, lead to a potential referendum majority as opposed to a leave majority, I suppose, of this election. So that's my take on this, but I don't know if you agree with that or if you disagree with that.
No, I agree. I think last time we had the question of what the Brexit Party's exit from politics would have on the Conservatives. Had the Conservatives reached their ceiling, or were they going to rise more? And it's clear that, I think unsurprisingly, the majority of Brexit Party supporters have moved over to the Conservatives, and that's been a significant boost. The polls are not... I haven't got the graph in front of me. I don't know if you can have a look at and see what the polls were like 2.5 weeks before the general election in 2017.
Maybe? They've changed everything around on the website. I can't see how to drag back behind. I don't know how you can go any further back.
Okay, never mind then. But I feel the polls were closing up a little bit quicker at the same time in 2017. It's not to say that it's impossible that Labour will rise more, and I think they will continue to tick up. The Conservatives at 45%, it really is high, and that is where you really are reaching a ceiling. I've seen some, it was mentioned at the start of the show by one of our patrons, one of our listeners, that the swing in the polls is massive, and that you have some giving the Conservatives a 19-point lead whilst others giving them a 7-point lead. Now, I've always trusted sites like Britain Elects. I've always said you need to rule out standout polls and follow the average, and it's unequivocal that the Conservatives have, a big majority over Labour. But as you say, the only question now is, how those votes are spread out. The Conservatives still need to... You need to remember that the Conservatives still failed to get a majority last time. They still need to take seats off Labour, and those constituencies where they're going to do it are not clear. They've got to keep those same seats in Scotland. The only reason Theresa May really was able to form a government like she did is because the Scottish Conservatives did so well and were able to take seats off the SNP. So there's still a lot to play for, but as I said in the main part of this programme, I think you are looking at either a Conservative majority or you're looking at a minority government from Labour. I don't think with these polling stats that Labour will recover to the level they need to win a majority come December 12th.
Yeah, and I think that's, well, I mean, we've said this before. I feel like the most likely outcome for this election is going to be not really getting us anywhere. So maybe a slight Conservative majority, which if they lose some of the one world kind of Tories that have stepped down, then maybe that gives them enough to pass their Brexit policies. Or alternatively, we get a minority Labour government with the help of Lib Dems and SNP pushing for a referendum, but then that just leaves us going around in circles again to a point.
Yeah, I think I follow like Jacob Rees-Mogg on Twitter, so I've got this quote from him that they say all the Conservative MPs have pledged to back Boris's deal if they get elected. Right, so I feel that rules out any, even if they got a majority of one, that should be enough because Boris has done enough to upset the rebels and throw the ones out of the party that weren't agreeing with him, and enough people have decided not to stand, that I think it was a prerequisite of being a member of the Conservative Party is that you had to promise to back his deal. If they will keep to that promise, if some of them are elected, is yet to be seen, but I feel a majority of one would be enough to get Boris's deal through. And he's hoping he can do it without the DUP this time. So anything less than one, and it again becomes very, very tricky for him to do anything.
So there's a few more changes I'd like to mention about the Britain Elects site. So previously they had like the rolling average, we're going to screenshot for you, and they would have the like the more historical view that we can't quite find. I'm sure it's somewhere on their site still. But they've added a few other big buttons at the top of the page. So there's now a Brexit tracker, which is would we vote for Brexit again? That's quite interesting. You can see in June 2017 is when it switched over to Remain being the majority. So that was around the last general election. And then Remain has been steadily increasing, and then suddenly in May dropped back down. And now there's kind of just a slight tendency towards Remain in the country. And when I say slight, I'll point out it's bigger than the win in the referendum for Brexit. But this is a poll, not a vote. And the other thing they have there is the Scotland tracker, which is should Scotland be an independent country. And I think that's more interesting because that comes into the discussions we're having about Labour, Conservatives and the SNP in Scotland. So when they had the referendum in 2015, it was almost 50-50, the opinion. And now, and then there was a majority for no, and now it's closing the gap again. So again, only 3% in it, which, again, it's going to be a big issue up in Scotland. Could see the Conservatives losing some seats, which, as you say, would hurt the possibility of a majority for the Conservatives. But also, we don't know how, maybe Labour will also lose there, but then they've said they would happily go into they've not said happily, but they said they'd negotiate with the SNP about having a referendum if it got their support. So everything is a bit up in the air, as we've already said.
Yeah. One of these days I'm going to have to do a podcast on Scotland and how it really messes up the election. My two sentences are that Labour used to do really well in Scotland and it could bank them seats. Then when in 2010 they started to lose out to the SNP and the SNP grew more and more, became a really big problem for Labour. The Conservatives didn't care because the Conservatives had never really won seats in Scotland. After the referendum, the SNP obviously got a huge swing, and there's a little bit of a fight back then. They got a big swing in 2015 after they lost the referendum because there was one party for Scottish independence and three other parties that weren't for it. So unsurprisingly, like 49% of the population all voted for the SNP, which got them a crazy amount, which again really didn't help Labour. Now both parties kind of rely on the votes there. Now it's so close. Both parties would much rather that the SNP didn't exist at all. I think they've certainly been a thorn in the Conservative side when it comes to Brexit, because there's a whole national issue of Scotland didn't vote to leave the European Union. Why are you dragging us into doing this thing we don't want to do? So, I'm glad Britain elects have added that feature, because Scotland is the unseen kingmaker in a lot of these things, and we tend to forget it because we're looking at elections from a very English perspective. But I'll be watching that with interest.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth pointing out the SNP and other parties are more than the Brexit Party in percentage in the poll tracker. But obviously, the SNP can only win seats in one place, so it really changes that maths, because they can get a load of MPs in Scotland. So yeah, I think that's it. It's been quite a long episode. I hope you don't mind the fact we've kind of gone for a deep dive on the manifestos and a bit of a deep dive on the polls this evening. I believe, is it our next time will be just before the election, so we're going to do kind of a quick update just before the election, probably half an hour or less, and then we'll come with proper coverage of the election that weekend. Is that the plan?
That sounds like the plan. Sounds like a good one.
Okay, that's a good plan. We'll do a quickish episode just before the election, just to give you our final thoughts, and then we'll see how wrong we are the day after. So thank you as always for joining us. Thank you to our friends in the chat who've come and chatted with us or corrected us or added their insights. You can do that by going to our link to come to our Discord server. You can always find us in all the usual places at parliamentary.observer. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at UnParlPodcast. And you can find us on Reddit/r/unparliamentary. If you want to support any of our shows, you can go to patreon.com/TTSS, where you can throw a few dollars our way to help with hosting costs and buying microphones and equipment and stuff. I believe there's Mishmash Mayhem is about to have another special, including Rob and myself, which will be coming out over the Christmas break. They're going on hiatus until the new year after that. And then there's also Astrocast is back now that everyone has kind of moved house and everything is settled down there. So there should be an Astrocast appearing fairly soon for all your Warhammer news. And there's a hat of many things on dinosaurs that I'm in the process of editing that should be out in December. So yeah, there's lots of stuff to come and listen to. Come and enjoy our shows. And there's even plots afoot to bring back a new improved season 3 of Dr. Wilco's. So lots of shows coming up in the near future. Yeah, I mean, if you like our shows, recommend them to a friend. That's the best way to spread news of the podcast, or come and give us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever app you use. And I think with that, there's nothing else for me to say than it's good night from me.
And it's a good night from him.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Hello and welcome to Fact Check UK, an independent podcast that has no links to any Tom or Rob-based organisation. And how are you, Rob? Rob?
I lost you for an entire... You just went silent in my ears. I'm very sorry. You may have to do that
That's
again.
fine. I'll repeat that.
Thank you.
For once, I didn't mess up the intro, and then you couldn't hear me. So, we'll do it again.
Stunned silence. Sorry.
Always good to have 2 takes. I will insert the clip here that I have not yet made of them talking about unparliamentary language in the chamber, which I'll just take completely out of context to make it sound like we were advertising the BBC. So